All right, and we are all connected. Take it away, Kelly.
Thanks, Tracy. Good evening. I'm Kelly Shimabukuro, Chief of Programs and Outreach at the Enoch Pratt Free Library. Thank you so much for joining us to hear from Erica Green, Tawanda Jones, Brandon Soderberg, Baynard Woods, and Maryland State Senator Jill P. Carter tonight. And thank you to Open Society Institute Baltimore for your continued partnership and the dedication to creating a roadmap for change. Before we officially start the program, I wanted to fill you in on some ways to continue connecting and engaging with the Pratt Library. We have sidewalk service at 14 of our libraries, so you can still access physical materials as well as mobile printing at these libraries. On November 4th, we began welcoming you back into the library with public computer reservations. In-person public computers use will be available at the Central Library, Southeast Acre Library, and the Pennsylvania Avenue branch by appointment only. We hope you will also join us for Not for the Faint at Heart tomorrow night. Senator Barbara Mikulski and Ambassador Wendy Sherman will be in conversation at 7 p.m. on Zoom and Facebook Live to celebrate the virtual dedication of the Senator Barbara Mikulski Room, and they'll talk about empowering the next generation and more. Details about everything I've mentioned can be found on prattlibrary.org. After today's program, if you're able, we hope you'll support our local independent bookstore and purchase your copies of I Got a Monster and 5 Days from the Ivy Bookshop. Now I'm thrilled to pass this on to Tara Huffman, Director of Criminal and Juvenile Justice of the Open Society Institute Baltimore, to introduce our speakers tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone. My name is Tara Huffman. I am Director of the Criminal and Juvenile Justice Program at Open Society Institute Baltimore. For those of you who may not be familiar with OSI, we are the only U.S. field office of the Global Open Society Foundations, which is an international group of foundations that works to build vibrant and inclusive democracies whose governments are accountable to their citizens. The mission of our work in Baltimore is to disrupt the long-standing legacy of structural racism by supporting powerful social change movements led by and centering the needs, interests, and voices of historically marginalized communities and communities of color. We're thrilled to co-sponsor tonight's event with the Pratt, since it gets to the very heart of our mission. All of the participants tonight have worked to uplift the voices and stories of Baltimore residents who are too often ignored, and we hope to continue to supporting all of them and their work. So let me introduce your panelists for this evening. Erica Green is a Washington, D.C. based New York Times reporter who covers the U.S. Department of Education, focusing on federal policy, educational equity, and civil rights enforcement schools. Before joining the Times, she covered the Baltimore 2016 Pulitzer Prize finalist for breaking news coverage of the death of Freddie Gray and the unrest that followed. She collaborated with Wes Moore on the book 5 Days, which details the April 2015 events through the eyes of Baltimoreans and as the Baltimore Uprising unfolded. We are also joined tonight by Tawanda Jones, a Baltimore-based activist and one of the people profiled in 5 Days. She is the sister of Tyrone West, who died in police custody in 2013. She and her family started West Wednesday, a weekly protest and safe ground to speak out against police brutality and murder. Jones and her supporters have moved West Wednesdays online, and tonight's event is being broadcast as part of their weekly live stream. Jones is the mother of 4 children, a pre-K teacher, and a freedom fighter. Brandon Soderberg was previously the editor-in-chief of the Baltimore City paper and a contributing writer to Spin. His work has appeared in the New York Times, Vice, The Village Voice, and many other publications. With Baynard Woods, he is co-author of I Got a Monster, The Rise and Fall of America's Most Corrupt Police Squad, which tells the story of the Baltimore Police Department's Gun Trace Task Force. Baynard Woods is a writer living here in Baltimore. His work has appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, The Washington Post, and many other publications. In addition to I Got a Monster, he is author of Coffin Point, The Strange Case of Ed McTeer, Witch Doctor Sheriff. Our moderator this evening is Maryland State Senator Jill Carter. who represents the state's 41st Legislative District in Baltimore. She previously represented of the House of Delegates from 2003 to 2016. Senator Carter is the daughter of the late Walter P. Carter, a revered civil rights activist and a central figure of Maryland's civil rights movement in the 60s and early 70s. Her mother, Zarita Joy Carter, was a public school teacher who specialized in early childhood education. Over to you, Senator Carter.
Thank you so much, Tara. I want to thank the Pratt Library and OSI for bringing this event and panel together and inviting me to participate. As a Baltimorean, I'm thankful for the work of each and every member on this panel tonight, and I'm honored to participate in this important discussion. I've read both books, and each book forced me to relive a range of emotions, many of which are still traumatic. Both books tell very important stories and highlight systemic maladies that must be fixed before we can achieve a city with a modicum of justice or racial equality. Readers are blessed to experience great storytelling and greater insight into the events around the 2015 Uprising and the 2017 and 2018 Gun Trace Task Force saga and exposure. There is in each of the books, I'll call it the political misleadership class, which is usually referred to as the political establishment or the political power structure. We tend to treat this class as if it's some giant living in the sky, rather than human represent us and have the responsibility and culpability for laws, policies, and the resources that govern our society, including policing and prosecution. Whatever you call it, can you talk about ways in which this unnamed character, as I call it, and its decisions over decades made Freddie Gray's life and death possible, made the Gun Trace Task Force the most corrupt squad in American policing possible? And that question is directed to any of the panelists that'd like to answer. But I would say the book authors.
I can go first. So, I think what 5 days makes incredibly clear is that, Freddie Gray was failed from almost the moment he was born, failed by failed policies for decades, whether it was the city's, lack of action in remediating lead poison homes, whether it was the school system that didn't get him the help that he needed, whether it was the systems in place that allowed his mother to fall into addiction and not be able to pull herself out, whether it was the juvenile justice system that took him on after he was pushed out of school, did not provide him with the education or any of the measures that he needed to not go back out to do what he was doing when he was pulled up by police. It showed a series of systemic failures, and you have to forgive me, I'm always a little measured because I am still a reporter. And I think for 5 days, there were turning points in Freddie's life, and we don't get too much into Freddie's life as much as we do his death. But through the characters, I think each character illustrates a way that leadership failed. Whether it was Tawanda and her family and their quest for justice, their pleas for justice, whether it was Greg Butler, who, just got completely screwed by a antiquated, line item in a policy that no one even bothered to ever revisit. Whether it was, Anthony, the owner of Shake and Bake, who, the city leadership literally came in and that was working for children and took it away from him, and now what's become of it? I mean, every action had some consequence, and I would say that's what I think 5 days really illustrates.
And I think to add to that, in terms of the gun trace task force, and I got a monster, the fact that the economy of the city became the drug war, that decisions were made by our politicians to really focus on, and we really tried to take the language seriously, to really focus on waging war on its citizens, force people to be on one side. You have people like Wayne Jenkins and Mamadou Gondo, who are from completely different worlds near Baltimore, in Baltimore or outside of Baltimore in the county. And they both decide to join the police force, not out of any desire to serve necessarily or to do something good, but because these were the options available to them. And so then, with no oversight, with the way that the police department went, it was about serving the police department rather than serving the citizens. And yet that was to placate the politicians, the mayors, and who make commissioners' heads roll and such. So they were willing to look the other way at the kind of corruption. And the guys who were doing it all over the city, whether they were dealing drugs or whether they were being cops, were just trying to find some economic opportunity for them to get by in this city.
And I would add something Boehner and I have been talking about since the book came out, like it sort of helped us process elements of this story even after the book was published, is this idea that the police, at least in Baltimore, but I think nationally, operate as essentially a special interest group that politicians in particular and the sort of leadership class need to cater to. And there's kind of a game going on there in which they kind of get whatever they want, whether that's a surveillance plane or more gear or more sniper rifles or whatever. And so I think that that's something we've really realized, is that they're really advocating for themselves and their department, often against the wishes of the city, which is sort of, really represented, I think, really strongly. I mean, something that 5 Days does such a good job is showing the many, many, many ways that it affected people and people's responses, and that it was going on before that. I mean, something that I was thinking about earlier today, was thinking about Senator Carter, was I was thinking about two things, which were, in 2006, there was that ACLU lawsuit about unconstitutional policing in Baltimore. At the end of 2005 is when the King and Murray police scandal happened, where these other cops were dealing drugs and working with drug dealers. So in 2005, 2006 are exactly where 10 years before our book takes place, and where 5 Days takes place, and we kind of were running into the same exact problems. And people like Senator Carter were calling attention to it. But again, there's this kind of leadership class that would rather not wrestle with those things or upset this special interest group that is the police.
Thank you. I agree. I used to say in Annapolis that we believed when it came to this one group, policing, law enforcement industry or complex, that we would allow them to make the laws rather than to govern us, rather than we make the laws to govern them. Erica, 5 Days. It's so multi-layered. 5 Days, it's really, 10 decades, really.
Yeah, so say 50 years.
So many different things and topics, from the history of Billy Murphy and William Donald Schaefer and the mayor's race, and so many things. It's a myriad of different characters, some of which are somewhat surprising to me. So my question to you is, how did you decide on this particular cast of characters, and how what was the reason behind selecting the ones that you did? And for instance, I was somewhat surprised to find John Angelos as a character, just because it seemed it was unusual in this type of a story. And so why is his story and all of their stories important? And why should they matter to us then and now?
Yeah, so I obviously didn't choose the characters on my own. I mean, it's Wes's book. Wes had a lot to do with that. And they are pretty interesting. What I can speak to is what a lot of them represent and why they were important. And in John Angelos, I will say, he represents a power structure of the city. He represented, the white wealthy families who a lot of these policies that we're talking about do not touch. He represented the white wealthy families who, barely even knew a curfew was in effect. who did not have the National Guard march in through their hoods, right? So he also, he represents a part of Baltimore that runs really deep. He is power, and how he used it during that time, we thought was very important. Granted, he went to Twitter, as we do these days. But for him, coming from this kind of storied, old Baltimore family, it was, it was a big step for him. And a lot of folks I remember that time. I actually remember when he decided to jump into the fray. A lot of folks were surprised, and this all started because he was attacked by a reporter who didn't understand, who basically chose to chastise him for shutting down Camden Yards. And so his understanding and being willing to speak up for what was happening outside of Camden Yards, I think West thought was very important. Some of the other characters, Tawanda, as we say, I was very heavily involved in her section in particular, which I was so honored to be a part of. But, she said, we said, before Freddie, there was Tyrone. And she watched as all of this unfolded, and her heart, and she unfolded with it. She took the lead. She stood up for him just as much as she did for her brother. But we didn't want people to forget, and I will never forget being a reporter on the ground, and I saw Tawanda at City Hall, and I'm not just saying this now, I really wondered how she felt watching this happen. When this woman had been screaming from the rooftops, and I imagine that it must have been incredibly painful, yet she was there for Freddie and everyone like him, and that's very, very honorable and admirable. And Tawanda should write a book herself. Greg, Greg had the gas mask. Everybody wanted to know who was the guy. Everyone wanted to know how the hell Greg got a gas mask. So, so he and for him, I was intimately involved in parts of his story too. When I found out Greg was the guy on TV, my heart sank because I knew what they were saying. I knew what I was watching. I watched what happened, but I just always wondered, like, what I want people to know, the Greg that I know. And Greg represents a lot in the city. That's a whole other. Baynard should talk a bit about that as well, because Greg really respects Baynard, and I came second fiddle to Baynard in some ways when I was writing his story. But Greg represents the resilience, the demands we put on our children in this city, the perseverance, but also the complete and utter, like, fed up, like, people, they are human. And I think what we see with Greg is that you can only take but so much. I'm trying to think of others because it was a bunch. Oh, Billy represents another power structure in the city that is ingrained, and just as John Angelo says, Billy represents, especially for Black people in the city, the power that you can have and the leadership that you can have, in such a divided city in some ways. And the community really turned to him during that time. I will just say, I will never forget, during that time, people said Billy was running the city, not the people who were elected to do so. I'm just being for real, right? So, so I'm rambling now, but
I was gonna say, well,
right.
I don't have to be measured. No one knows me to be. Well, somebody had to run the city during that time.
Right.
One of my favorite characters was actually Malik, who's really a sub character under Anthony Hamilton's story, but the way he stood up for Shake and Bake and wouldn't allow anyone to mess with it, I love that.
I know, it was such a powerful moment. It was such a, and they really did Our kids are resilient and they can only take but so much.
So, Tawanda Jones. Tawanda, the story of your brother's killing by police 2 years before Freddie Gray was not captured on video. There were no citywide marches. No officers were arrested or charged. Your crusade for justice for Tyrone West, your support for the Gray family, and all victims of police brutality were featured in the book 5 Days. I met you because you came to Annapolis before Freddie Gray, and that's another story that is often untold, that before Freddie Gray, Annapolis, we presented legislation for police reforms in Annapolis, and it went on deaf ears, and they turned a blind eye, and then Freddie Gray happened, and there was this panic to come together to create cosmetic legislation, but Tawanda was there from the beginning, I think all the way back to 2013 or 14 with Christopher Brown's bill. But what I'd like to know from you, Tawanda, is can you talk about what justice for Tyrone would mean at this point and the obstacles that you faced in demanding accountability? Are the officers that killed your brother still working in policing? What are the reasons that the state and the Baltimore Police Department have neither charged anyone or reopened any investigations in the face of new evidence? What are the reasons that you've been told?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so first of all, I want to thank you. I said, you know that you are my hero because you always fight for things that are right. You've been fighting, like, I remember spending the night down there in Annapolis testifying against the Officer Bill of Rights and the Christopher Brown law and things of that nature. But before I go into your question, which are great questions, I wanted to give a shout out to Baynard and Brandon, as well as Erica and Westmore, for these powerful, true books. Like, I mean, this is amazing, and it's sad at the same time because having been, and I'll tell you guys, having been in literally in both of these books, and I'll explain why once I get into everything and answer my question. But having been a part of both of these books, it's horrible, and that just shows you the level of corruption right here in Baltimore City. But so my family and I, the West Coalition, shout out, we are a family. We have been on the ground now for 382 weeks, 2,674 days, fighting nonstop for accountability, not just for my brother Tyrone, but for all the victims of police brutality. But when you have a corrupt system, and then when you have, like, we change mayors as we change clothes, we change commissioners as we change clothes. So basically, long story short, as we've been fighting for this so-called accountability, what my family deserves, because I feel like there is no justice. It's just us trying to hold folks accountable. But no family should never have to go through this. And then also to kind of dive back, there were videos of my brother. They just did never touch surface because the very next day, after my brother was murdered, me and my family galvanized from day one, literally day one, trying to seek and search for answers. And we went on the block where my brother was murdered to see at the time Commissioner Anthony Batts standing around with officers, knocking on everybody in Kentmore and Causeway door, collecting video footage, cell phone video footage from everyone's camera. Because how we knew video were available was solving witnesses on the news. They told us they had videos. And to this day, we have not got any video. To this day, we have gotten no accountability. And literally, like Erica and Westmore put, in the 5 days, our struggles, like literally being on the corner telling them how corrupt Baltimore City policing is. Like, people thought me and my family was crazy. We literally told them how my brother was murdered, how they hid his body for 5 days, 5 whole days. No, it was no reason for them to do that. no reason, but literally they came to my family's house on the same day that he was, I'm sorry, not the same day, but the next day after my brother was murdered, basically telling our family what the autopsy was going to say. That took them 154 days to do. Like, this is utterly ridiculous, which it was basically complete on the 19th. But I said all this to say, the reason why we basically have no type of accountability, because you got to think about how deep this corruption is. And just like with the gun trace task force that was literally around doing everything, they were on the ground literally when my brother Tyrone West was murdered, being as one Ruiz. He was a part of the gun trace task force. He was the first killer cop that started the brutal execution of one unarmed man. My brother pulled over, and from that point, he started pepper spraying him, beating him, murdering him, pulling him by his dreadlocks. They called in fake signal 13 because so much, I'm not even gonna say fake, but because Chapman sprayed so much of pepper spray, he wasn't thinking about Tyrone West's eyes. He was thinking about his eyes, so he called for backup. And literally, when the other 11 to 15 maniacs arrived, no one thought about my brother who screaming, pleading for his life. Help, what are y'all doing? Y'all in a victim's name, and was murdered in broad daylight. And then they let a 320-pound man, David Lewis, sat on my brother's back. So I said all this to say, and with the new evidence, we took all that to Marilyn Moses. We took it. And to no avail, she have not met back with my family. Is sitting on her desk, collecting dust. And then I see how adamant and eager she appeared to be when she was so-called seeking accountability for Freddie Gray. I think that was absolutely for the cameras. That's my opinion, but I think it was for the cameras, because shortly while she's doing all this facading, here it is, Keith Davis Jr. is gunned down, not, while the uprising is happening, like literally no accountability, nothing. And for her, and I found out in the book about the gun trade, I got a monster. I found out, like, literally, you're doing all this stuff, playing this big old game, like, you so cool. Accountability, the speech sounded beautiful. I loved it. I cried. My family was the one who actually got her into office. Like, we literally, when Greg Bernstein got out of office because we told no one to vote for this animal, she got in, and what have she done for my family? Nothing. But play the game. Everybody wants to say, oh, this, that, and the third, but nobody wants to do something. So when it comes to accountability, I blame people for this dog and pony show. The medical examiner's office, the new mayor. I'm sorry, not the new mayor, but Jack Young. Thank God he's about to get out. It shows you the divide. Literally, we just had Ryan Dorsey to try to do something so great for families like my family that's suffering. Literally tried to rename a space, a Columbus statue space, something that's meaningless, pointless. I guess the Italians and the FOP paid him off, but literally he beat on that bill. While he could be worried about homeless people, you're gonna go veto a bill. He needs never to work for this city ever again. And if he tries to, the West Coalition is going to shut him down. So I said all to say, I'm still waiting on Marilyn Moses. She hasn't done anything. And then for me to know that Ruiz and Chapman are repeat violent offenders, there's a video of Ruiz. Actually, he had 6 victims. My brother was a fatality, so he had victims lead up and after my brother. All this is new. I literally, out of my own pocket, I'm a teacher, I don't get paid much at all, but I took $50,000 of my own money that I had saved up and got my brother's body exempt. Literally, I had to take my name completely out of the part where we were going to get money, the monetary pay, because they wanted to gag me. You're not going to gag me and shut me up for murdering my brother, so I can't tell about Killer Ruiz and Killer Chapman. I'm going to keep calling about. But no one is safe until we get these killers off the street. But if we think that the gun trace task force stopped and this book, after the book was closed, we think that it stopped. No, it didn't. But the reason I'm going to tell you real quick, why I'm a part of this book, to know the first victim, and nobody knows this, the first victim of Wayne was my boss. In 2010, my boss, a woman that works hard for a school, literally, this animal framed her, took money, hard-working money that her husband and her established, working, not selling drugs, not committing or breaking the law, but hard-working dollars, actually took $20,000, called this money, like did the work. So I said all of that to say that that's horrible. And to know that your boss is in a book You're in a book about freaking corruption and it's still not changed. I'm sorry for babbling on. Sorry for.
I could listen. I would love to listen to you all night, but I need to bring Baynard and Brandon into the conversation. So
Yes.
we'll circle back. Baynard and Brandon, I had Jerry Maguire deja vu. You had me at hello. After reading the opening line of your book, I was in love. Baltimore almost had a revolution, it starts. I knew that it was a must read, and I knew that I would be reading some much welcome brutal truth. Repeatedly throughout the book, I Got a Monster, the individual stories that you tell, we see the sociopathy and toxic masculinity play out on steroids, I'd say, with Wayne Jenkins and other members of the force. Jenkins with his condescending hyper-politeness, calling victims sir while violating their rights, robbing them, and even torturing some of them, which is how I would describe what he did to Anthony Hamilton and his wife and his entire family in their home. Can you talk about the myriad of ways that this culture of toxic masculinity permeates the Baltimore Police Department and serves to normalize the behavior of these officers in the Special Enforcement Squad?
You want me to start that, Brandon, and then you jump in? I mean, it's crazy when you think about what they were doing without some of our cultural, the way that we're habituated to thinking about police. It's really the Iliad. You have this band of pirates riding around, and they see people in palaces, nicer houses than they think they should have, and they decide they're going to rob them. And they use every war technology that we have to break in their houses, to take it. And you see it play out in so many different ways, because and they're almost all, although one of their lieutenants was a woman, Lieutenant Marjorie German, all of the people who were really involved in what they were doing were men. And they had this risk-taking, gambling, misogynistic, some of the, when the Department of Justice report came out, I interviewed and listened to all of the testimony that was given to the Civil Rights Division there about the treatment of sex workers by Baltimore Police Department officers, many of whom were associated with the plainclothes units. And the plainclothes units really are the biggest problem with this. They're trying to be macho. They're trying to go out and prove that they are warriors rather than defenders. It comes to, at one point, Wayne Jenkins pulled over a guy. They take him, he takes his phone and then starts trying to text the guy's partner to see if she will say anything incriminating, pretending that he's him, that he's the guy, and then just starts asking for nude pictures, just as a way to destroy these people's lives. When he found out that the main case in the book, that the guy that was hiring the lawyer that he didn't want him to hire, Ivan Bates, they went and faked a note and said that the guy had gotten someone else pregnant and stuck it on the wife's door to try to break up the family there. There's this really disregard, a piratical disregard for every kind of, any kind of social grace that is not just brute force, masculine brute force. And maybe like the way that links in with the opioid epidemic and the way the story plays out would be a good place that you could jump in, Brandon.
Yeah, sure. I mean, one thing I would add would be that, when we were learning about this scandal more in depth during the trial at the beginning of 2018, you would see the officers testifying, you get to hear some wiretaps. What was really compelling and disturbing was you saw the sort of game of one-upmanship among each other and the sort of constant, and you realize that's the culture of policing, this sort of hyper-masculine nonsense, but like you would see the way that like there's a moment in the book where they chase someone, they cause a crash, and they wait rather than help the person, so they don't get caught for chasing the person. And in that audio, you can hear one of the officers, Herschel, kind of making jokes about it. And that's really disturbing because it just feels like this sense of like, how far can you go? In terms of, the sort of one-upmanship of cruelty that they were doing. And so that's an important kind of element of it that is partially why we really decided to tell this through scenes, as the book is sort of, to us, was sort of thinking of it as very cinematically, or like a novel where you have scenes rather than us sort of pontificating. So we sort of start with that frame that Senator Carter mentioned of like Baltimore almost had a revolution, and that political frame sort of allows us to tell the story, and we hope that these ideas are seen through. Sort of related to this toxic masculinity, you have the opioid crisis, really the overdose crisis is a part of this book, because it speaks to the failings of the investigation, the failings of oversight, because what was happening with these cops was they were basically discovered because the feds were trying to catch people that were dealing drugs and trying to charge people who dealt drugs with overdoses as a result of those drugs, which is a really bad policy in general, to charge people with murder for dealing drugs. And so what happened was, through one of the crews the FBI was investigating, which was a black drug crew that was essentially selling to white folks that were coming in from the county, they got onto a wiretap to one of the cops. And so even the way they fell into this story ties to this sort of real look at justice, or criminal justice, or policing, from this very sort of carceral perspective of these bad people dealing drugs. They did this, because another thing we always try to stress is like the civil rights investigation that Boehner mentioned was happening while these officers were doing all this, and the DOJ didn't catch it, and it was all caught basically by accident. They fell into it, and that's something to really stress. And then when you put that on top of the idea, the government was really trying to enforce really fraught and stigmatizing perspectives on drugs and drug enforcement that led to this. It's really just another layer that makes the story really frustrating, and sort of shows how little has been learned about how to curb policing, or how to fix and adjust other problems in the culture, like issues with drugs and the drug war.
Thank you. So we have to, only a few more minutes, we have to get to questions, but what you said drives me into the final question I'd like to ask you in this segment, which is the fact that this happened post Freddie Gray, post time that the Department of Justice found patterns and practices decades longer of systemic discrimination within Baltimore Police Department and the way it conducted policing. My question is, how is it possible that the internal affairs divisions, how is it possible that the state prosecutor, how is it possible that the commanders and police commissioner were unaware of these activities until the feds came in and conducted that investigation and found out what these officers were doing? How is it possible? How is it possible? And do you have any knowledge of, or any sense of, any efforts that have been being done now or since to take a deeper dive into that behavior beyond the gun trace task force? Brandon?
There we go. I mean, I think that the only generous reading you could possibly give the department and its command is that they were supremely incompetent and unaware, and like a profound lack of accountability and transparency allowed this to spread. There's almost no way that they would have known about some of it. We certainly, some as high as sergeants have been indicted in other indictments that were in charge of these guys. And then you get a sense that command knew these kind of different elements of it. And so what I do think that happens is that the looking the other way when you're so focused, this goes back to the first question about sort of how we see policing. If you see policing as this experiment that needs to put people in jail and keep the city safe and provide the illusion to the political leadership that there's things are in order, then you're really willing to look the other way and not question how they're doing the arrest. And that's kind of the place to start. I'm kind of hedging here because I have my own theories, but we weren't able to prove empirically that these people knew everything. And also, as you see in the book, the kind of lies and the way that the lies have been handed down, it's sort of this dirty cop wisdom. Like, you compartmentalize your units, you tell different people different things, and sort of put these walls up. But if you see that even those walls are up that kind of prevent someone from knowing all of the truth, like a commander, the simple fact that they were making so many arrests and so many gun arrests should have been an indicator to anyone that was interested in the citizenry and not only interested in statistics, interested in being able to put a bunch of guns on a table and say, yesterday the Gun Trace Task Force captured these guns on the street. Baltimore is safer now because there's 5 less guns, when in fact we have something like 30,000 to 40,000 guns flying around in the city at any given point. But that kind of looking the other way, I think, is absolutely true. It's hard to, there are some of these accountability work groups and stuff the city has had are sort of a focus you see at those, including one of our characters in the book, Ivan Bates, spoke at, where he really stressed like these gun convictions were just not going through. So that's how I think the state's attorney's office, even if you want to take a generous reading of how they operated, that like if your officers can't charge a gun, they can't really do any, like a gun case is pretty easy, right? Did he have the gun on him? Yes, okay, it's over. Like that's how they work. If you can't prove that someone had a gun, or your cops aren't showing up to say that basic thing, these people are then having these cases dismissed. It should have been another red flag. So the seizure of the gun should have troubled people in power. And then the way the guns weren't being prosecuted, even if they were somehow sometimes legitimate arrests, should have also really been a tip that there wasn't anything. Things were not on the up and up. In one interview we did, someone compared it to like something like the performance-enhancing drug scandals in sports, where like everyone's like, I don't know how that guy's hitting a lot of home runs. I'm not going to ask. Like that's kind of that idea. How are they getting all these guns? We're just not going to ask.
And to add one thing real quick, the one policy thing that prevents IAD from being able to stop them is they're not allowed to do patterns and practice investigations, like the kind of investigation that the DOJ did, where they look for patterns among officers. So if you have, as they did, a dozen Herschel complaints, you can't compare those complaints by policy and say, oh, he did the same thing to all dozen of these people. You have to look at every single complaint separately and pretend that the others don't exist. And so you're trained not to notice patterns, or if you do notice them, you're not allowed to look at them. And then on the court side, the number of times we saw judges who were willing to sign warrants that they shouldn't have been signing, saw prosecutors ignoring body camera evidence that showed the officers breaking into houses, saying, well, it was after the arrest, so it kind of doesn't matter. And then judges saying, well, you might have a good lawsuit, but not, it's almost like when reporters like us said after the 2016 election, oh, we're not going to do the horse race coverage anymore. And of course we did. But the courts really, prosecutors and sometimes defense attorneys as well, do the horse race kind of thing. Did I win or did I lose, rather than did I achieve justice or not?
Can I add something? What I love about I Got a Monster and the fact that these books are coexisting together is, it taught, even when I talked to Tawanda, when I talked to Jenny Egan, who's another character, anyone who had any, real deep experience with law enforcement, if someone came in blind and just interviewed them about what they had seen or experienced, you would truly think they were crazy. You'd be like, there is no way. There is no way. And that's kind of what I would say some of the media has done to people like Tawanda and others, for decades. The consent decree came out and Black folks were like, yeah, we've been saying this, and everyone was like, oh my goodness, they are pulling people over for, it's what I love about this book is it just shows how ingrained and insidious and depraved some of these experiences can be, because otherwise, you really, really wouldn't believe it. We didn't even get into Tawanda went through after after she had exhumed her brother's body and did the autopsy, and some of the very strange experiences she had around her house, outside of her house. That once I was reading, Boehner and Brandon's book, I was like, this is completely and utterly possible. Actually, I'm surprised it didn't escalate. It's just so incredibly validating. So I just wanted to throw that out there, and I have theories on how this could have happened, but it's hard as a reader to believe that people didn't know.
Very sure. I'll just say tell me about it. And, you know, we can all attest to the years that the General Assembly turned a blind eye and pretended that those of us that testified on these issues were crazy and making it up. But listen, we're getting short on time. I want to hit the questions, but I want to do it sort of like a speed dating thing. So I'm gonna say the question, and then someone just give the quickest answer so that we can try to get through the list before the clock runs out. Okay?
Okay.
All right. Let me see. I've got to get back to the top now. I said be quick, and now I'm not because something's going on with my screen. Okay, if Baltimore Police Department is a special interest group, and this question is from Mike Quindian, if it's a special interest group, why overwhelmingly do Democratic politicians cater to their many deleterious needs and subsequent criminal activities? That's probably a question better suited for me, and I would say because tradition and power in me, and it's probably a longer answer than that, but if anybody wants to add to that, that's fine.
Real quick, I would just say that not being interested in police accountability is a bipartisan issue in this country. Like, we had maybe the largest protest in American history over the summer against police violence, and we're debating defund the police or pretending we don't understand what it means. You know, I think that, like, that's the answer in a way, is like not holding police accountable is because it's such a powerful special interest group. Maybe the same way, you know, we can't deal with the climate crisis or other issues like that, is because it's an incredibly bipartisan issue. Both sides kind of agree we don't touch the police.
I had a question from Bill Blank. In Westmore's 5 days, which I'm enjoying, he nevertheless speaks rather negatively of the uprising after the police killed Freddie Gray. After he speaks negatively of rebellions in general, referring to them as riots, however, as Douglas wisely said, there is no progress without struggle. In fact, for the 30 years prior to the murder of Freddie Gray, in spite of hundreds and hundreds of cases of police brutality and murder, only 5 Baltimore cops were ever indicted for brutality during those entire 3 decades. In contrast, in less than 1 week, 6 officers were indicted for the death of Freddie Gray. The rebellion did that, and yes, those cops were not found guilty and not incarcerated as they should have been, but without the rebellion, they wouldn't have even been indicted, which was more than happened previously in the previous 3 decades. So my question is, what is your opinion of the uprisings and revolution as components in the struggle against police brutality and racism? Erica?
Yeah, I'm gonna answer really diplomatically and answer and invoke how Wes has answered this question. I'll just say, you know, a riot is the language of the unheard, a very wise man once said, and whether or not it was responsible for the indictment, I think Tawanda probably has more thoughts on what led to the indictment of the officers, or the charges, I would say. You know, I think that's very much up for debate. I don't think that we can say that it was the uprising that led to that unequivocally. So.
Can I add real fast?
Sure. Yes.
Yeah, no, so I kind of like feel both ways, because I feel like, especially with my family being out there peacefully, not turning up anything, we weren't hurt. But it's just said that we live in a capitalist system, and until things start burning down, that's when it becomes real. And it's sad, but it's reality. In any type of uprising, you see that, and then here comes, you know, they want to pretend like they want to do stuff, but it's until that happens. So that's just my take on it.
Thank you.
I want to chime in because real quick, sorry, is the one thing I'd add is, like, you know, if you understand the uprising as Bill's question suggests, that it's sort of a proto-political insurrection, and, you know, it's completely reasonable to respond to violence with violence, which is what happened during the uprising. It kind of explains itself, I think. The only thing I'd add is some way that I've kind of begun to interpret the announcement of the charges is that it was a kind of deeply conservative with a lowercase c decision, because what the charges did was squash the insurrection. The result was, by charging the officers, we are going to let some of the pressure out, and we won't have a revolution. And so I think that's kind of another way to think about charges and how progressive prosecutors start to understand these ideas of reform and police accountability, is that, and I think in Baltimore, with 5 years to look back, I really see it as a deeply conservative and anti-revolutionary decision to prosecute those officers, because I think it's exactly what stopped a truer, larger insurrection from happening.
I got a monster question by Anonymous, an attendee. The current mayor vetoed a memorial for victims of police violence so it would not offend police. Do you think silence represents complicity in the police department's bad actions? Who do you think is responsible now for the bad actors in the police department? The state's attorney, mayor, governor, FOP, who? Anyone?
I think all of them. Every last one of them. I think each and every last one of them are complicit as to why the things are being done the way they are. It's like their team is not just taking down bad officers and bad attorneys. It's like all of them work together against people, and it's just sad.
And I'll add to that I think we are responsible as well. I'll add to that the citizens of Baltimore are also responsible, and especially the white citizens who are willing to look the other way. And we used to look the other way because we were scared of crack or something, and we're like, oh, and so we let people be stopped and frisked and zero tolerance over drugs, and now we're not. And so they just switched it to from the war on drugs to the war on guns, and now white people are okay with all of the abuses that happen in East or West Baltimore again, as long as they're not happening in their neighborhoods. And so I feel that like the citizens of Baltimore and especially the white citizens are also responsible. We expect to be protected by the law, and we expect other people to be bound by the law, and that's one of the biggest problems that allows things like the gun trace task force to happen. Is that honest?
For Ada Kwanzaa, 2 questions. Does the Maryland State Court of Appeals recent rulings on James and Potts cases put to rest any concerns the General Assembly had about restoring local control of BPD and the impact of higher caps on tort liability for local and state agencies? And the second question is, to Baynard's point about the judicial system enabling the gun trace task force, what actual reforms can prevent similar police misconduct from continuing to happen? Would you like me to answer? So there are continuing discussions about local control of the Baltimore Police Department, and I agree that the tort liability claim that was brought up a couple of years ago has been negated, and so I do think that we're closer to doing that now. And there's a whole myriad of reforms that we are pushing. I'm leading a bunch of them. The Black Caucus is behind many of them, and it begins with the repeal of the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights, redefining use of force standards, creating real accountability mechanisms, and extracting police disciplinary records from the Maryland Public Information Act so that they aren't protected under that and described as personnel records, just to name like 3 of about 20. Anybody else want to chime in? Okay, from Shanika, what made you interested in writing such a book with regard to the focus on police corruption? Anyone?
I mean, I think that for Baynard and I's book, there's a lot of reasons we felt like the story illustrated bigger issues. Maybe the one I'll just throw out there to keep us moving along would be that when you hear citizens, as I've heard being a reporter, telling you that the police operate like a gang, and you're trying to kind of unpack that idea, and then there's a federal indictment that basically says they're operating like a gang, it really allows you to get deeper into the story and explore and unpack it. And you don't have to sort of do the throat clearing or the hedging or whatever, where you try to explain why people feel this way. You have sort of this very strange moment where the FBI and Donald Trump's DOJ inexplicably felt like they had to indict these cops, they were that bad, and charge them as if they were a gang or like the mob. That's just a really good, it gives us really stable ground to tell the story and unpack those ideas in a more detailed way, and not having to sort of just be like, here's why people think this. Like, if the FBI thinks, you kind of can move along and get a little deeper into it pretty quickly.
Thank you. We are only a few minutes left, and so I'm going to pose the opportunity for each of you to make a final statement, but I'd like to preface it with a question. And my question is, corruption is embedded in police that are forced to abuse and oppress poor Black people. The people become their chattel. So how do we end this cycle? It is important to tell the stories, but what do we do about it? And each of you 1 minute, and then I think that we're out of here.
Maybe I'll start. We could end the drug war. Be a good start, and I just mean that as a start. That's not the end of it, but stop using the war on drugs and the logic of the war on drugs, which, as Baynard sort of said, as the book shows, has been expanded to things like the war on guns and other forms of just finding every and any other way to incarcerate people. Yeah, I mean, I guess like one more thing real quick with my parting moment would be like, just wanted to really praise and say that 5 Days is a really great book, and I love that these two books exist together, and they kind of are ours is almost a sequel to that book. I love that they both have a similar sort of narrative style and really look at characters and people affected by this on a lot of different levels, and it's a really great way, I think, to tell this story. And I think it's sort of really cool that we have these two books happening around the same time. A smart National Book Reviewer maybe should notice it and written a review of both of them. But
thanks, Brandon. I would just say, I mean, I certainly didn't set out to write a book about police corruption, and I certainly many thoughts but I can't be advising on policy. I would just say that I think what these books show is that this cycle of oppression is literally baked into everything. It's cyclical, it's perpetual, and it's enabled by political leadership, by policies, by the oppression that Black people, especially in Baltimore, have been subjected to by various institutions. And I really believe that, you know, where I am right now in this moment, having gone through the process of writing this book, that it has been largely a lack of accountability that has allowed this to continue.
Thank you. Brandon, and then Tawanda.
So I think,
Baynard, I'm sorry.
no problem. I mean, I'm so happy to be on this panel. I think that there's something about the people on here with journalists and reporters and activists and politicians, although even more than just politician with Senator Carter. And so I think having conversations like this goes some way, and I think we really have to think the willingness that we're giving police the control to let them do this as a city, as a country. We're the ones who are making these decisions that stand for this and allow for this to happen. And so I think that people need to really think about what they want in their own communities. We did a lot of work after this. We did a story for The Intercept on safe streets and an idea of harm reduction. And you know, the cure violence approach is that violence is contagious, and police bring violence into our community, and yet we expect them to solve the violence in our communities. And I don't think that's the way we can think about it. And this pandemic gives us an opportunity to rethink it as public health, to rethink racism as public health, to rethink policing as public health issues and crime as public health issues, and think about them in that light rather than acting like people who just refuse to wear masks running around in the equivalent of our police world. And so I think that it really, a lot more lies on us than to the citizens than we think it does.
And last but not least, Tawanda, can you close us out?
Yeah, so I want to thank everybody, and especially the authors, the book writers, just for letting our truth be told. And I want people to realize that when you're reading this stuff, this is our reality. But until we come from a place where we're accepting this being complacent and not stepping up to the front line, no matter what. When they said the war on drugs, that was the war on black and brown people. Let's be crystal clear. So we're more than hashtags and body bags. We're more than being 6 feet in the dirt and pictures and buttons on t-shirts. Our lives matter, and we just got to keep our fists up and keep fighting peacefully until we get accountability. Until we win, we're never going to give up. All case matters, and we need to make sure that they reopen all these cases ASAP. And one last thought, and I'm out. All these commissioners need to start rewarding these killer cops. Commissioner Davis, he gave he gave Wayne Jenkins a reward, as well as Louise and all that, and even the new commissioner sat with my family and then turned right around and gave Louise a reward for killing us. Enough is enough. We tired of the dog and pony show. Thank you.
Thank you, Tawanda Jones, Brandon Soderberg, Baynard Woods, and Erica Green. Thank you for 5 days, and thank you for I Got a Monster. Thank you, OSI and Enoch Pratt Library. It's been a wonderful discussion. Peace, we're out.
Thank you, Senator. Thanks, guys.